Your video just hit 10 million views. The voice came through the cracked speaker of an old phone, distant and unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life, not hers. Hannah Brooks didn't answer right away. She just stood there in her tiny kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, her fingers still wrapped around a worn wooden spoon as steam curled up from the pot in front of her. The soup was simple. Carrots, potatoes, a little bit of chicken she had stretched across 3 days. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and tonight, that felt like enough. Eli was asleep in the next room, curled up under 2 mismatched blankets, his small body barely moving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. The apartment was colder than it should have been for late October, but the heater had stopped working last winter, and fixing it had never made it to the top of the list. There were always other things. Rent. Groceries. Gas. Life had a way of stacking priorities until warmth became optional. Hannah stirred the soup again, watching the surface ripple under the dim yellow light. This was the one thing she still knew how to do right. After the layoff, after the interviews that led nowhere, after the polite smiles that never turned into calls back, cooking had become her anchor. Not because it paid well. It didn't. But because it gave her something to offer when everything else felt like it had been taken away. The phone buzzed again on the counter, the screen lighting up with a number she didn't recognize. She wiped her hands on a faded dish towel and picked it up, her brow tightening slightly. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious, tired but steady. There was a pause, then a breath on the other end. "Ma'am, I'm not sure if you've checked your TikTok account today." Hannah blinked, glancing instinctively toward the corner of the counter where her phone usually sat while she recorded short clips of her cooking. Nothing fancy. Just quick videos. A few seconds of chopping vegetables, a quiet moment of pouring broth, sometimes Eli's tiny voice in the background asking if it was ready yet. She never expected anyone to really watch. It was just something to do. "No," she admitted softly. "I've been busy." The man on the other end let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "Your video from yesterday, it's everywhere." Hannah frowned slightly, her mind flipping back through the blur of yesterday. The market. The long walk home. The man sitting on the sidewalk near the bus stop, his hands shaking as he tried to hold on to a paper cup. She remembered the way she had hesitated for just a second, glancing down at the container in her bag. It had been the last portion she had planned to sell. The one that would have covered dinner tonight. She had given it to him anyway. No speech. No hesitation after that. Just a quiet smile and a simple, "It's still warm." She hadn't thought about it again. "I think you might want to take a look," the voice said gently. Hannah turned toward the counter, her heartbeat slowing, not speeding up, as if her body refused to believe anything significant could be happening. The soup bubbled softly behind her, steady and unchanged, filling the room with a familiar scent. For a moment, everything felt exactly the same. And yet, something had already shifted. She just didn't know it yet. Hannah set the phone down slowly, as if it might break under the weight of whatever it was trying to tell her, and for a moment she just stood there listening to the quiet bubbling of the soup behind her, the same soft rhythm that had carried her through nights that felt longer than they should have been, nights where sleep came in pieces and worry filled the gaps in between. She wiped her hands again on the dish towel even though they were already dry, then reached for her phone, her thumb hesitating just above the screen as a flicker of doubt crossed her face, not fear exactly, but something quieter, something more familiar, the instinct to expect nothing so she would not be disappointed. When the app finally opened, the brightness of the screen made her squint. And for a second she thought she had tapped the wrong account because the numbers did not make sense, they climbed too fast, too high, rows of zeros that did not belong to someone who usually celebrated getting 100 views on a good day. She blinked and refreshed the page, then did it again, her heartbeat beginning to shift, not racing but deepening, like something inside her was trying to catch up to what her eyes were seeing. The video played automatically, and there she was, caught from an angle she did not recognize, her hair loosely tied back, her coat slightly too thin for the weather, the container in her hand still warm as she knelt just enough to hand it over to the man sitting against the brick wall. There was no dramatic music, no staged moment, just the quiet exchange. The way she smiled softly and said something too low for the camera to catch, the way the man's hands trembled as he accepted it, the way she stood back up and adjusted her bag before walking away like it was nothing. Hannah felt her throat tighten slightly, not because of what she had done, but because of how it looked from the outside, how something so ordinary to her had become something people were watching over and over again. The comments began to scroll faster than she could read them. Words like kindness, real, thank you, I needed this, appearing again and again, strangers attaching meaning to a moment she had not thought twice about. She pressed her lips together, unsure what to do with the feeling rising in her chest, a mixture of disbelief and something softer. Something almost like being seen for the first time in a long while. From the other room, Eli shifted in his sleep, a quiet sound that grounded her instantly, and she turned her head toward the small hallway, reminding herself where she was, who she was, what still needed to be done. The soup on the stove bubbled a little stronger now, and she quickly lowered the heat, her movements automatic, practiced, steady even as her mind struggled to settle. The phone buzzed again in her hand, this time with messages, notifications stacking one after another, names she did not recognize, offers she did not understand, and still she stood there in her kitchen, surrounded by the same chipped countertops and dim light, trying to make sense of how a single quiet moment had somehow traveled farther than she ever had. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the wall for just a second before disappearing, and Hannah found herself staring at the door as if something might be waiting on the other side, something different, something new. But when the light faded, everything looked exactly the same again, except now, in the palm of her hand, the world was knocking, and it was louder than she had ever heard before. The notifications did not stop, they multiplied, each vibration in her hand sharper than the last, as if the phone itself could not keep up with the attention it was receiving, and Hannah found herself setting it down on the counter just to breathe, just to hear something normal again. But even the kitchen felt different now, like the air had shifted without asking her permission. She reached for a bowl and ladled the soup carefully, the motion steady and familiar, one scoop, then another. Watching the steam rise as it always did, as if nothing outside this room had changed at all. For a moment she focused only on that, on the warmth in her hands, on the quiet certainty of doing something she understood, something that did not come with questions she could not answer. Eli's door creaked softly as he pushed it open. His small figure wrapped in one of her oversized sweaters, the sleeves hanging past his fingers as he rubbed his eyes and looked toward the kitchen. "Mom?" His voice was still heavy with sleep, soft and uncertain, and Hannah turned immediately, the tension in her shoulders easing the second she saw him. "Hey, baby," she said gently, setting the bowl down and kneeling just enough to meet him halfway as he walked toward her. "Did I wake you?" he asked, glancing at the phone still lighting up on the counter. She shook her head with a small smile, brushing his hair back with her fingers. "No, it is okay, I was just finishing up," she said, keeping her tone light, steady, the same way she always did when things felt uncertain. He looked at the phone again, curiosity flickering across his face. "It keeps buzzing," he said quietly, and Hannah followed his gaze, her smile fading just slightly as she stood back up and picked it up again. The numbers had climbed even higher, comments stacking so fast they blurred together, messages from people asking where they could find her, where they could buy her soup, if she had a store, a website, anything at all. She swallowed slowly, her thumb hovering as she scrolled, trying to make sense of words that felt too big for her life, too fast for the pace she had been living at for so long. Another message popped up, this one longer, more direct, from someone with a verified badge next to their name, and she hesitated before opening it, her pulse steady but heavy, like each beat carried more weight than before. Eli tugged gently at her sleeve, bringing her attention back down to his level, and she looked at him, really looked at him, at the way his cheeks were still flushed from sleep, at the quiet trust in his eyes that had never once questioned whether she would take care of him, no matter how hard things got. She set the phone face down on the counter again and picked up the bowl, handing it to him carefully, watching as his fingers curled around it for warmth. "Eat slowly, okay?" she said softly, and he nodded, already focused on the rising steam. For a few seconds, that was all that existed, a small kitchen, a warm bowl of soup, and a mother making sure her child was fed. But behind her, the phone lit up again, brighter this time, louder, insistent in a way it had never been before, and though she did not pick it up right away, something inside her had already begun to shift, not in fear, not in excitement, but in quiet realization that whatever was happening out there was not going to fade away like everything else usually did, and for the first time in a long time, Hannah Brooks stood in the middle of her small kitchen feeling like the world had finally found its way to her door. The morning came too quickly, as it always did, but this time the light that slipped through the thin curtains felt different, sharper somehow, as if it carried something with it that had not been there before. Hannah was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with her phone in both hands, her elbows resting lightly against the worn surface as she stared at the screen, not scrolling, not tapping, just watching the numbers continue to climb in a way that still did not feel real. Sometime during the night, the video had crossed another threshold, millions turning into more millions, comments multiplying into stories from strangers who said her small act had made them call their parents, help a neighbor, cook a meal for someone they had never noticed before. She read a few of them slowly, her eyes softening, her expression quiet, absorbing the words not as praise but as something heavier, something that carried responsibility she had never asked for. Behind her, Eli shuffled into the kitchen again, this time more awake, dragging his backpack along the floor as he moved, the zipper half open and a small stuffed toy peeking out. "Do we have school today?" he asked, his voice more alert now, and Hannah looked up immediately, grounding herself in the question that mattered most. "Yes, we do," she said gently, setting the phone down and standing up, moving toward the stove where the last of the soup from the night before still sat in the pot. She reheated it slowly, stirring in silence, her movements calm but her mind still circling everything she had seen, everything she did not yet understand. The phone buzzed again, louder now in the quiet morning, and this time Eli noticed too, glancing toward it with growing curiosity. "Is it work?" he asked, and Hannah paused for just a second before answering, her hand resting lightly on the spoon. "I am not sure yet," she admitted softly. She walked him through the usual routine, helping him zip up his jacket, checking that his shoes were tied, making sure he had everything he needed even though her thoughts kept drifting back to the screen behind her. When they stepped outside, the air was crisp, colder than the day before, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself as they walked down the narrow sidewalk toward the bus stop. Everything looked the same cracked pavement, the same quiet street, the same distant sound of traffic moving through a world that had always felt just out of reach. But when they reached the corner, something shifted again. A woman standing nearby looked at Hannah twice, her expression changing from casual to curious, then to something more certain, and she leaned slightly toward another person, whispering something under her breath. Hannah felt it immediately, that subtle shift in attention, not harsh, not unkind, but different enough to make her straighten her posture just slightly, her hand instinctively finding Eli's shoulder. The bus arrived with its usual hiss of brakes, and as Eli climbed on, he turned back for a quick wave, his smile small but bright. And Hannah returned it, holding on to that moment for just a second longer than usual. As the bus pulled away, she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and when she reached into her pocket to check her phone again, she saw something new waiting there, not just messages, not just comments, but an email marked urgent, from a name she did not recognize but somehow felt important. And as she stared at it, standing alone on the sidewalk with the morning moving around her, she realized that whatever had started as a quiet moment in her life was no longer staying small, and for the first time, she was not sure if she was ready for how big it was about to become. Hannah did not open the email right away, not because she did not want to know what it said, but because she needed a few more seconds where things were still manageable, still within the quiet rhythm of her own control. So she slipped her phone back into her coat pocket and started walking, her steps slow at first, then more deliberate as if movement itself could help her think. The street felt different now, not louder or busier, but more aware, like the world had tilted just enough for her to feel it under her feet, and she kept her gaze forward, avoiding the curious glances that lingered a second too long. When she reached the small corner store where she usually bought extra ingredients, she paused outside the glass door, catching her reflection for just a moment, her coat still the same, her hair still pulled back the same way. Nothing about her appearance explaining why everything else seemed to be changing. Inside, the bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped in, and the familiar smell of coffee and warm bread wrapped around her like it always did. grounding her in something she understood. The cashier, an older man who had seen her come in countless times before, looked up from the register and gave her a small nod, but this time there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes that had not been there yesterday, and it made her hesitate just slightly before returning the nod. She moved through the aisles quietly, picking up what she needed with careful precision, calculating each item the way she always did, even though her phone in her pocket kept buzzing, reminding her that something outside this routine was trying to reach her. When she reached the counter, the man leaned forward just a little, his voice lower than usual, almost as if he did not want to draw attention. "That was you, right?" he asked, not accusing, not intrusive, just curious in a way that felt surprisingly gentle. Hannah blinked, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her wallet, and for a moment she considered denying it, keeping everything contained. But something in his expression made her pause. She nodded once, small and uncertain. And the man's face softened into something warmer, something closer to respect than curiosity. "That was a good thing you did," he said simply, scanning her items without another question, and Hannah felt something shift again, not outside this time, but inside, a quiet acknowledgement that what had happened was no longer just hers to carry alone. She paid and stepped back out into the cold air, her breath catching slightly as the wind brushed past her, and this time she did not wait. She pulled her phone out. Her fingers colder now, her pulse steady but firm as she opened the email that had been waiting. The message loaded slowly, each second stretching just enough to make her aware of the weight behind it, and when it finally appeared, her eyes moved across the words carefully, absorbing them one line at a time. It was not just a message of praise, not just another voice among thousands, it was something structured, something intentional, an invitation, a proposal that spoke about scaling, about reach, about turning what she had into something bigger than she had ever imagined. She stood there on the sidewalk, the sounds of the city moving around her, cars passing, people walking, everything continuing as it always did, but the words on her screen did not belong to the life she had known yesterday. Her fingers hovered just above the reply button, not typing, not moving, as if she understood that whatever she chose next would not just change her day, but everything that came after it. And for the first time since the video had started spreading, Hannah Brooks realized that this was no longer about being seen, it was about deciding what she was willing to become once the world was already watching. Hannah did not reply to the email right away, even though her thumb hovered just above the screen, because something inside her held back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had taught her to think twice before every decision, to measure every step against what it might cost later. Instead, she locked her phone and slipped it back into her pocket, her fingers lingering there for just a moment as if to remind herself that it was still real, that it had not disappeared. The second she looked away, the walk back home felt shorter than usual, or maybe her thoughts had stretched time in a way that made distance harder to measure, and when she reached her apartment door, she paused again, her hand resting lightly on the handle before pushing it open. Inside, everything was exactly where she had left it. The same small kitchen, the same faint smell of soup still lingering in the air, the same quiet that had once felt heavy but now felt fragile, like it could break if she moved too fast. She set her groceries down slowly, lining them up on the counter with careful precision, her movements deliberate, grounding, as if she needed to remind herself that she still belonged here, that this life had not been replaced overnight by something she did not recognize. The phone buzzed again, and this time she did not ignore it. She pulled it out and opened the email once more, reading it again from the beginning, slower this time, letting each word settle instead of rushing past it. The message spoke about opportunity, about scaling her homemade meals into something larger, something sustainable, about connecting her story to a wider audience that had already shown they were paying attention. There was no pressure in the tone, no demand, just a clear path laid out in front of her. One that seemed almost too structured for the life she had been living. Hannah exhaled quietly, her shoulders rising and falling as she leaned lightly against the counter, her gaze drifting toward the small hallway where Eli's room sat, empty now but filled with everything that mattered. She thought about the nights she had counted coins just to make sure there was enough, about the mornings she had woken up before sunrise just to prepare enough food to sell, about the quiet decisions she had made over and over again to keep going even when no one was watching, and now, suddenly, everyone was watching. The phone screen dimmed slightly, and she tapped it again, her thumb finally moving to the reply button, not quickly, not impulsively, but with a steady certainty that had nothing to do with the numbers she had seen and everything to do with the life she was trying to protect. She began typing slowly, choosing each word carefully, her voice in the message the same as it had always been, simple, honest, direct, not trying to impress, not trying to become something else just because the world had noticed her. Outside, the light shifted again as the afternoon moved forward, casting longer shadows across the floor, and when she finished typing, she paused one last time before sending it, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen, still the same woman she had been yesterday, still standing in the same kitchen, but now holding something she had never held before, a choice that could change everything if she let it, and for the first time since all of this began. Hannah Brooks did not feel overwhelmed by what was happening around her, she felt focused on what mattered most, making sure that whatever came next did not take away the one thing she had never been willing to lose, the quiet, steady kindness that had brought her here in the first place. The message sent with a soft, almost unnoticeable tap, and for a moment Hannah simply stared at the screen as if expecting something immediate to happen, some visible shift that would confirm she had just stepped into a different version of her life, but nothing did. The kitchen remained quiet, the same faint ticking of the clock on the wall marking each second with steady indifference. She set the phone down again, this time with more intention, as if she had placed a boundary between herself and whatever response might come next, and turned back toward the counter where the ingredients she had just bought were still neatly arranged. The normalcy of it grounded her, the simple act of reaching for a knife, of washing vegetables under cool running water, of slicing them into even pieces with practiced precision. Each motion reminding her that no matter what was changing outside, this part of her life still belonged to her. The afternoon moved slowly, sunlight shifting across the floor in narrow lines that stretched and softened as the hours passed, and Hannah worked quietly, preparing another batch of soup, not because she needed to prove anything, not because of the views or the messages, but because it was what she had always done. Her phone remained on the counter, silent for longer than she expected, and she found herself glancing at it only once or twice, each time with less urgency, as if she was slowly reclaiming her sense of pace. When the sound finally came, a single notification breaking through the quiet, it did not startle her the way the earlier ones had. She dried her hands and picked up the phone, her expression steady, her breathing even as she opened the message. It was a reply, concise but clear, thanking her for her honesty, acknowledging her boundaries, and suggesting a conversation rather than an immediate commitment, a meeting, a chance to talk through possibilities instead of rushing into decisions. Hannah read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because it felt different from everything else she had received. It did not try to pull her in, it did not promise overnight transformation, it simply offered space, something she had not realized she needed until that moment. She leaned lightly against the counter again, her gaze drifting toward the window where the light had begun to fade, and she allowed herself to consider it, not the numbers, not the attention, but the possibility of building something that did not take away from who she already was. From the hallway, the faint sound of footsteps echoed as Eli returned, his backpack thumping lightly against the wall as he dropped it in his usual spot, and Hannah turned instinctively, her focus shifting immediately, her priorities realigning in a way that required no thought. "How was school?" she asked, her voice warm, unchanged, and he launched into a small story about something that had happened in class, his words quick and slightly out of order the way they always were when he was excited. She listened fully, nodding, asking questions, smiling at the right moments, the phone still in her hand but forgotten for now. As he spoke, she realized something quietly but clearly, that whatever was happening, whatever opportunities were beginning to form, they would only matter if they could exist alongside this, alongside the small, ordinary moments that made up their life. Later, as Eli sat at the table eating, the steam from the bowl rising gently between them, Hannah picked up her phone once more and typed a short reply, agreeing to a conversation, nothing more, nothing less, her words simple, her tone steady. She pressed send without hesitation this time, not because she was certain of what would come next, but because she trusted the way she was choosing to step into it, slowly, carefully, without losing herself along the way. And as the evening settled in around them, the quiet hum of the apartment returning to its familiar rhythm, Hannah Brooks felt something new take shape, not a sudden change, not a dramatic shift, but a steady beginning, one that grew from the same place everything else in her life had always come from: patience, intention, and a kindness that had never needed an audience to exist. The next morning did not feel louder, but it felt fuller, as if the air itself carried more weight, and Hannah noticed it the moment she opened her eyes, not because anything in the room had changed, but because something inside her had settled into a new awareness that was impossible to ignore. The phone rested on the nightstand beside her, quiet for now, but no longer invisible, no longer just a tool she used occasionally. It had become a doorway, and she knew that stepping through it would require more than curiosity. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back as she listened for the familiar sounds of the apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, and then the light footsteps of Eli moving in the next room, grounding her again in the rhythm that had always come first. She stood and walked into the kitchen, her movements steady, her mind clear in a way that surprised her, as if the decision she had made the night before had created space instead of pressure. She reached for the ingredients without hesitation, setting them out one by one, the simple act of preparing food anchoring her in something real while everything else remained uncertain. The knife moved through the vegetables with quiet precision, the sound soft but consistent, and she found comfort in the repetition, in the way each step followed the last without question. Her phone buzzed once, then again, but she did not reach for it immediately. She let it sit, choosing to finish what she had started before turning toward whatever was waiting. When she finally picked it up, the message was short, confirming a time for the conversation later that day, offering a video call instead of an in-person meeting, something that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. Hannah read it once, then again, her expression thoughtful but not tense, and she typed back a simple confirmation, her words calm, measured, leaving no room for anything but clarity. She set the phone down and exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing as she returned to the stove, stirring the soup as it began to warm. Watching the steam rise in thin, delicate lines that disappeared into the air, Eli entered the kitchen a few minutes later, his energy brighter this time, his eyes more awake, and he climbed onto the chair at the table with a quiet familiarity that made everything else fade for just a moment. "Is today different?" he asked suddenly, his voice curious but not worried, and Hannah paused, her hand resting on the spoon as she considered the question. She looked at him, really looked, at the way he waited for her answer without rushing, trusting that whatever she said would be enough. "Maybe a little," she replied gently, her tone steady, her smile small but real. He nodded as if that made sense, as if a little change was something he could understand, and he reached for the bowl she placed in front of him. His attention shifting to the warmth in his hands, Hannah watched him for a second longer than usual, letting the moment settle, reminding herself that no matter what came later, this was still the center of everything. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second bringing her closer to the call she had agreed to. And though she could feel it approaching, she did not feel rushed by it. She felt ready in a quiet, grounded way that did not come from confidence in the outcome, but from trust in how she would handle it. Outside, the light grew stronger as the morning unfolded, casting a soft glow across the small kitchen, and as Hannah stood there stirring the pot, listening to the quiet sounds of her life continuing as they always had, she understood something clearly, that whatever was about to change would not come from the attention she had received, it would come from the choices she made when no one was watching, and that was something she already knew how to do. The time for the call arrived quietly, without any dramatic shift in the room, just the soft glow of the phone screen lighting up on the table as the scheduled notification appeared, and Hannah stood there for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter as she took a slow breath, not to calm herself, but to center herself, the way she always did before stepping into something unfamiliar. Eli had already left for school, his small wave still lingering in her mind, a reminder of what mattered most, and the apartment felt still again, but not empty, just focused, as if everything around her was waiting for her to take the next step. She wiped her hands on the dish towel out of habit, even though there was nothing to clean, and picked up the phone, her fingers steady as she tapped the screen and accepted the call. The connection took a second, then another, and finally the image appeared, a man seated in a bright office space, the kind she had only seen in passing on television, large windows behind him, sunlight spilling in across a polished desk, everything clean, structured, controlled. He looked up almost immediately, his expression calm, not overly eager, not distant either, just present in a way that felt intentional. "Hannah," he said, his voice even, respectful, and she nodded slightly, adjusting the phone so it rested securely in her hand. "Thank you for taking the time," he continued, and she noticed that he did not rush into explanations, did not overwhelm her with numbers or projections. Instead he asked simple questions first, about her, about how long she had been cooking, about why she started sharing those small videos in the first place. Hannah answered honestly, her words measured but natural, speaking the same way she always did, not trying to shape her story into something more impressive, just telling it as it was. As the conversation continued, he listened more than he spoke, nodding occasionally, his attention focused in a way that made her feel heard without being examined, and slowly, the space between them shifted from unfamiliar to something more grounded. He eventually spoke about the opportunity, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual expansion, a way to help her reach more people without losing what made her videos feel real, suggesting support, resources, guidance, but always circling back to one point, that whatever they built would have to remain true to who she already was. Hannah listened carefully, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed but attentive, and she realized that this was not the kind of conversation she had feared. It was not about changing her, it was about understanding her first. When he paused, giving her space to respond, she did not rush, she let the silence sit for a second, the same way she did when deciding how much to spend at the store, when choosing what to cook with what little she had. "I do not want to lose what matters," she said finally. Her voice quiet but clear, and he nodded immediately, as if he had expected that answer, as if it was the most important one she could have given. "Then we build around that," he replied simply. The words settled between them without pressure, without urgency, and Hannah felt something shift again, not outside, not in the world that had suddenly started paying attention to her, but inside, in the way she understood what was possible without giving up what she had always protected. The call continued for a few more minutes, details discussed lightly, next steps suggested but not forced, and when it ended, the screen returned to its quiet reflection, showing her own face for just a moment before going dark. She lowered the phone slowly, her hand resting at her side as she stood there in the same small kitchen, the same light falling across the counter, everything unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, something had begun to take shape, not a sudden leap, not a dramatic shift, but a path, one she could walk at her own pace, one that did not require her to become someone else. And as she turned back toward the stove, the familiar motion of stirring the soup waiting for her, Hannah Brooks understood that for the first time, the future in front of her was not something she had to survive, it was something she could choose. After the call ended, the silence in the apartment did not feel empty, it felt settled, like something had been placed gently into its right position, and Hannah stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her hand still loosely holding the phone as if she was allowing the conversation to finish echoing through her thoughts before she moved on. She did not rush to celebrate, did not reach for the numbers or the messages that were still waiting. Instead she turned back to the stove, lifting the spoon and stirring slowly, the motion steady, almost meditative, as if this simple act was her way of confirming that she was still in control of her own pace. The soup simmered softly, the familiar scent filling the small kitchen, grounding her in something that had not changed despite everything else beginning to shift around her. The phone buzzed again on the counter, but this time the sound did not carry urgency, it felt like background noise, something she could choose to acknowledge or ignore, and for now, she let it sit. Minutes passed, maybe longer, the clock ticking forward in quiet consistency, and Hannah moved through the kitchen with the same careful rhythm she always had, adjusting the heat, tasting the broth, adding just a little more seasoning, her attention fully present in what she was doing. When she finally reached for the phone again, it was not out of curiosity, but out of readiness, and she opened the messages one by one, not rushing, not overwhelmed, simply observing what was there. Among the comments and offers, one message stood out, not because it was louder, but because it was simpler. A woman thanking her for reminding her to cook for her elderly neighbor, a man saying he had not spoken to his brother in years until he saw her video, small shifts in other lives that had nothing to do with money or opportunity, and everything to do with the same quiet kindness that had shaped her own. Hannah read them slowly, her expression softening, her shoulders relaxing as she absorbed the meaning behind the words. And for a moment, she understood that what had spread beyond her control was not just a video, It was a feeling, something that had moved from one person to another without needing her to guide it. The sound of the door opening pulled her attention away as Eli stepped back inside, his energy filling the small space instantly, his backpack hitting the floor in the same familiar spot. His voice quick and bright as he began talking about his day. Hannah smiled, setting the phone aside without hesitation, kneeling slightly to meet him as he spoke, listening fully, responding naturally, the world outside fading again in the presence of what mattered most. Later, as they sat at the table together, the soft glow of the kitchen light casting a warm circle around them, Eli looked up at her with a small pause between bites. "Are we okay?" he asked, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity, and Hannah felt her chest tighten just slightly at the simplicity of the question. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his, her voice calm and certain. "We have always been okay," she said, and he nodded, accepting the answer without doubt, returning his focus to the bowl in front of him. After he finished, after the dishes were cleared and the apartment settled back into its evening quiet, Hannah picked up her phone. Once more, not to chase what was happening, but to acknowledge it, to respond where it felt right, to leave the rest untouched. She moved through the messages with intention, choosing carefully, not letting the volume of attention dictate her actions, and when she finally set the phone down again, placing it gently on the counter, she did so with a quiet certainty that had not been there before. Nothing in the room had changed, the same walls, the same worn table, the same steady rhythm of her life continuing as it always had, but within that sameness, something new had taken root, not a sudden transformation, not a life turned upside down overnight, but a steady expansion, one that allowed her to remain exactly who she was while still stepping into something more. And as Hannah Brooks turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway, the soft darkness settling around her, she understood that whatever came next would not define her, it would simply grow from everything she had already chosen to be. The next few days did not arrive all at once, they unfolded slowly, one quiet decision at a time, and Hannah moved through them with the same steady rhythm she had always relied on, waking early, preparing soup, getting Eli ready for school. But now there was something new layered into the routine, not pressure, not urgency, but presence, a subtle awareness that each small action carried further than it used to. The follow-up messages from the man she had spoken to came without insistence, each one outlining options rather than demands, offering support without trying to take control, and Hannah responded in the same tone, clear, measured, always returning to what mattered most to her, keeping the process simple, keeping it real. One afternoon, a package arrived at her door, not large, not extravagant, just a box with her name printed neatly on the label, and she stood there for a moment before picking it up, her fingers brushing over the surface as if to confirm it was meant for her. Inside, she found a small camera, simple to use, along with a handwritten note that read, "So people can see what you see," and Hannah exhaled quietly, her eyes resting on the words longer than expected, not because of the object itself, but because of what it represented, not a replacement for what she had been doing, but an invitation to continue, just with a clearer lens. She set it on the counter carefully, not rushing to open it further, not immediately incorporating it into her routine, because she understood that even something helpful needed to fit into her life naturally, not disrupt it. That evening, as she prepared another batch of soup, she placed the camera nearby, letting it sit there, not recording yet, just existing within her space, and she found herself glancing at it occasionally, not with hesitation, but with consideration, as if she was deciding how much of her world she wanted to share. Eli noticed it almost immediately when he came home, his eyes lighting up with curiosity as he pointed toward it. "Is that ours?" he asked, and Hannah smiled softly, nodding once. "I think it is," she said, her tone light but thoughtful. He moved closer, examining it with careful interest, his small fingers hovering but not touching, waiting for permission that she gave with a quiet nod, and as he held it gently, turning it slightly in his hands, Hannah watched him, realizing that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer just about her. It was about how this new path would shape the life they were building together. Later, after dinner, she finally turned the camera on, not with a grand introduction, not with a rehearsed message, but simply placing it where it could see what she was already doing, her hands moving through the familiar steps of chopping, stirring, tasting, her voice quiet as she spoke naturally, explaining nothing more than what was in front of her. The recording light blinked softly, almost unnoticed, and Hannah found that after a few minutes, she forgot it was there, returning fully to the rhythm she knew, the one that had never required an audience. When she finished, she turned it off just as simply, setting it back on the counter, and for a moment, she stood there in the quiet kitchen, the same space that had carried her through so much, now holding something new without losing what had always been there. She did not check the footage right away, did not rush to post it, she let it sit, just like everything else, allowing herself to move at a pace that felt right, and as she turned off the light and walked toward Eli's room to check on him before bed, Hannah Brooks understood something with quiet clarity. That this was how her life would grow, not in sudden leaps, not in overwhelming changes, but in small, intentional steps, each one rooted in the same place she had always stood, steady, patient, and quietly strong. The next video did not begin with an announcement, it began with a sound, the soft scrape of a knife against a wooden board, steady and unhurried, the kind of sound that did not demand attention but invited it, and Hannah moved through the frame the same way she always had, no introduction, no explanation, just her hands preparing the ingredients with quiet focus. The light in the kitchen was slightly warmer that day, the afternoon sun slipping through the thin curtains and settling across the counter in a way that made everything look softer, more intentional. Even though nothing about her routine had changed, she spoke only when it felt natural, her voice low, calm, explaining why she chose certain ingredients, how she stretched what she had, how she made something simple last longer than it should have. And there was no performance in it, no effort to impress, just honesty carried through small details. When the video ended, she did not watch it back right away, she set the camera aside and returned to the rest of her day, helping Eli with his homework, folding laundry, moving through the evening with the same quiet rhythm that had always defined her life. It was only later, after Eli had gone to sleep and the apartment had settled into its familiar stillness, that she picked up the camera. Again, sitting at the table with her phone beside her, the soft glow of the screen lighting the space just enough to see clearly, she transferred the footage slowly, her fingers moving carefully as if the process itself required attention, and when she finally pressed play, she watched in silence, her eyes focused not on herself, but on the small details she had never seen from the outside before, the way her hands moved without hesitation, the way she paused just slightly before adding seasoning, the way her voice softened when she spoke about making something stretch further than expected. She did not look different. She did not seem like someone who belonged in a world of millions of views, but there was something in the simplicity that felt steady, something that did not try to be more than it was, and she understood, maybe for the first time, why people had responded the way they did. She uploaded the video without changing much, just a short caption, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to capture attention, and when she set the phone down afterward, she did not wait for the response. She turned off the light and stepped into the quiet hallway, checking on Eli before heading to her own room. The next morning, the shift was not immediate, but it was there, subtle at first, the notifications building again, the numbers rising, but this time Hannah did not feel the same distance from it. She understood it differently, not as something happening to her, but as something growing around what she had already created. Messages came in from people asking how they could buy her soup, where they could support her, how they could share what she was doing, and for the first time, she did not feel unsure about how to respond. She felt ready to take a step forward without losing her footing. She began replying one by one, her words still simple, still honest, explaining that she was working out a way to make it possible, that she wanted to do it right, not quickly, and as she moved through the messages, she realized that the attention was no longer overwhelming, it was becoming something she could shape, something she could guide in a way that stayed true to her. Later that afternoon, as she stood at the stove once again, the familiar steam rising in front of her, the camera quietly recording nearby, Hannah Brooks understood something clearly. That what had started as a single moment had not just changed her life overnight, it had revealed something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. And now that it was, she was not rushing to become something else, she was choosing to let it grow, slowly, carefully, in a way that would last. The weeks that followed did not erase the life Hannah had known, they reshaped it gently, like hands guiding something fragile into a stronger form, and every morning still began the same way, with quiet footsteps across the small kitchen, with the soft sound of a spoon against a pot, with the steady rhythm she had trusted long before anyone was watching. But now, the space felt warmer, not because the walls had changed, but because something within it had grown, something that reached beyond what she could see. Orders had begun to come in, not in overwhelming waves, but in steady requests, people asking not just for food, but for something they had felt in her videos, something honest, something real, and Hannah answered each one the same way she had answered everything else in her life, carefully, intentionally, making sure she could give what she promised without losing the quiet integrity that had brought her there. The support she had agreed to slowly took shape around her, helping her organize, helping her reach people who needed it, but never replacing her voice, never speaking for her, and she held on to that balance with quiet strength, the same way she had held on to everything else that mattered. Eli noticed the changes in his own way, not through numbers or messages, but through the small differences: the kitchen a little warmer, the groceries a little fuller, the way his mother no longer paused as long before making certain decisions. And one evening, as they sat together at the table, the steam rising gently between them, he looked up at her with a small, certain smile and said, "It feels easier now." And Hannah did not answer right away, because she knew that what he felt was not just about comfort, it was about stability, about the quiet shift from surviving to living. She reached across the table, her hand resting over his, her voice soft but steady. "It is," she said, and this time, she knew it was true. Later that night, after Eli had fallen asleep, Hannah stood alone in the kitchen, the same space that had carried her through every difficult moment, now holding something different, not a dramatic change, not a sudden success story, but a life that had expanded without losing its shape. She turned on the camera one more time, not to capture something extraordinary, but to record what had always been there, her hands preparing another pot of soup, her voice quiet as she spoke about stretching what you have, about giving when you can, about trusting that even the smallest act can reach further than you expect. When she finished, she did not rush to check the response, she simply turned it off and stood there for a moment, the soft light settling around her, the quiet returning in a way that no longer felt heavy, but complete, because nothing about who she was had changed. She had not become someone else overnight, she had not been transformed by attention or opportunity, she had simply been seen. And in being seen, she had chosen to remain exactly who she had always been, steady, kind, and quietly strong. And somewhere beyond that small kitchen, beyond the screen, beyond the millions who had watched her without ever meeting her, something just as quiet had begun to happen, people noticing each other a little more, choosing kindness a little sooner, remembering that change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins with something as simple as a warm meal offered without hesitation. And if this story stayed with you, even in the smallest way, if it reminded you of something you had almost forgotten, then maybe that is where it continues, not here, but with you, in whatever quiet choice you make next. And if you feel it, you can share that moment, or simply stay for more stories like this, the kind that do not try to change the world all at once, but gently remind us that it already can.